solutions that corruption is overwhelmingly a private sector issue and much less so government. Right? It's easy to single out governments where, for instance, out of these $50 billion that leave the country, 2 to 3 billion of these are attributed to government corruption and government officials being bribed. 30 billion, so 60% of the financial flows leaving the continent every year are because of what we call commercial transactions, so primarily tax evasion and tax avoidance. Now, when we talk about businesses, and I'm definitely not one to sort of evade our own responsibility in that, but it's important as well when we're talking about corruption in Africa to remember that a big chunk of it isn't about African companies, but about foreign companies doing business in Africa. Right? The most famous example of this, if you remember, was the Siemens scandal, where maybe you guys discussed that this morning. No? Okay. Just double checking so I don't repeat things. But Siemens had, for the longest time, had on their balance sheet what they called useful expenditures, which is bribes, and that led to sort of a massive investigation globally into Siemens business practices in the developing world, which lasted 2 years, ended up with Siemens getting the biggest fine from the US government for corrupt practices. Right? So it's important to remember that it's not that a big part of the corruption issue that we face are important. Right? More recently, if people have been following the massive railway projects in East Africa, most notably the Nairobi-Mombasa line or the Djibouti-Addis line, which cost respectively $2.3 and $4.5 billion, are not only from the onset been plagued with investigation into corruption, but currently in Kenya there are several investigations open for various illicit practices that would have occurred on the part of the implementing companies, with the Chinese companies. Again, not to say that not to absolve ourselves of that responsibility, but I wanted to bring that in since a lot of the discourse on corruption tends to blame us for it. So it's not exclusively us. I'll add one more thing, if I may, from the term of the way actually businesses, especially small businesses, handle corruption in Africa. Now, they know that this is how companies that work across different countries, most of the time, have gotten to know how things are done, right? So if you're like me, I'm from Cairo, I know that if I want, certain government paperwork to do, I have to put a £20 bill in it. I know that if I don't, that's going to delay my permit by a week. I know that this, I know that that, right? So in a way, the problem becomes not the corruption itself, but the unpredictability of it. In the sense that, and we see that all across the continent, right? If the rules are known, is one thing. If the rules are not, if you know that border post will one day charge you extra money for the small farmers, say, crossing the border between countries, which is often a big part of the trans-border trade is done by small farmers, right? Smallholders. So if they know what the rules are, is one thing. If the rules will change every day, it makes it impossible for them to plan that way. But it also, that unpredictability also makes corruption to become a de facto barrier to entry. Right? If I know that I'm going to pay 50 for that service, regardless of whether that 50 is the government fee or if the government fee is 20 and it's a bribe of 30, if the rules are known is one thing. If the rules are not known and if you're a new entrant, especially if you're a small business, then the cost of doing business becomes significantly higher. So I'm going to sort of wrap this and close with the point that I wanted to make on this, is that oftentimes the companies, the business people that are the most affected by corruption are not the large companies, they're the small businesses and they're the micro businesses. And that's important when we think of solutions. Because a lot of the anti-corruption initiatives that we come up with, we as in Africa, think whether they're things that are sponsored and supported by, say, the EU or the African Development Bank, or international initiatives like the EITI, the Extractive Industries, the EITI, Industries Transparency Initiative, yes. Right. All of these look, more often than not, look one on the government side of it, not only on the private sector, but also it tackles usually more the large businesses than the small companies, right? And as such, if we're thinking of solutions, it's important that we sort of get out of doing things the way we used to do with those big initiatives, which I admire and am grateful for, despite their flaws, and we're happy to talk about this a little bit. But we need to start looking at the small business side of it and also the business-to-business aspect of corruption. So I'll pause here. Thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And I think we've been focusing a lot on African countries and corruption. And I like how you sort of made that point that, you know, we cannot put all the blame, because with corruption, it's a two-party system, right? So it takes the person who's either giving you the bribe and you accepting it. And I think that's extremely important to know. You know, as a professor of global affairs, I study corruption not only particularly in looking at African countries, but just looking at in a broad, more on a macro level. And the question that I am most interested in and have been studying and following is, how does corruption become socialized? How does it become normalized? How does it become a part of culture? I think we need to sort of understand that first, because once we start to figure out what are the root causes, how does it become socialized, where you know that if you have to pay for a permit, and it's like, look, I have to put that $20 in the envelope, and that's just the normal way of business, becomes a normal way of life. How did we get to that point? I actually started studying and looking at institutions of education as a vehicle in some of the moral breakdowns that we're having in some of the societies that we're looking into. With countries that have high levels of corruption, one thing that I found that was actually a constant thread was that there were also high levels of corruption and bribery in institutions of education, even starting at the primary level, where if I wanted my child to get into a particular school or into a particular high school or college, I can easily wield my influence and pay that teacher or pay that administrator. If I wanted to pass a class, it wasn't necessarily on my merits, but it was how much money I was able to get. And for most part, one thing that I saw was that how women in areas of corruption were even more disenfranchised. When we started interviewing women and asking them what were their perceptions on corruption, and they had different answers than that of the men, I started to look closer and say, what? And the reasons were because what they were bartering wasn't actually money. Some of them were being sexually harassed, some of them were being sexually assaulted, all because they wanted to pass that class. And that's an area that we don't necessarily talk about. So if the second, you know, institutions of education are one of the most important institutions in our society. They are the breeding grounds for socialization. They help teach young people right and wrong. They set up what morality is. So if that institution fails, what does it mean and what are we producing out into society? That means that if a young person is going to school and they are taught, or by that authority figure, and especially in areas where that's culture driven, where you have to respect your elder, right? Because we have to also put into the culture that also plays a role into this. You have to respect your elder, you have to listen to those in authority. They are less likely to question and oftentimes are more likely to just sort of appease that professor or that person of authority. And so they start understanding the concept of what it means to be successful, what it means to be able to move forward in life, that it's not necessarily on my merit, but what I can provide. And so those individuals now go out into the different sectors. They go into law, they become police officers, they become civil servants, they become judges, they become entrepreneurs and business owners, oftentimes with that same mindset. So if we're going to try to figure out and understand how corruption happens in different sectors, from the government to institutions to the church to the local level, I think we also need to look at institutions of education. And one of the things about corruption is that when we talk about corruption, we always talk about the economic cost of it. We don't ever talk about the human cost of corruption. People are dying because of corruption. Services that are supposed to be rendered by government are not being rendered because of corruption. Federal money that's supposed to go into institutions of education, that's supposed to go into the healthcare sector, are not going there. They're being diverted into private pockets and offshore accounts. And we don't talk about that enough. We always focus on how much money we're losing and how much foreign direct investment is not going into these countries. But let's be honest here. If we look at most of the multinational corporations, they're outsourcing because, one, it's cheap labor, and because a lot of these governments do not enforce their labor laws. So a country that has high levels of corruption, it possibly may be beneficial to some of these corporations and some of these companies because they benefit off of this idea of instability, economic instability. They benefit of not enforcement of rules and regulations. They benefit oftentimes of the backdoor deals that we see. This has been going on for a long period of time. So when we talk about colonialism, let's just talk about, one, the human cost of it, how it has become socialized. In many of the African countries, it's become a normal way of life, right? Even young people know that, you know what, in order to get this or in order to get that, I have to do this, no matter how brilliant they are. It's a system that they have to grow up in. It's a system that they have to live in. And also, even with the challenges that a lot of the African countries are facing, one of the things that I've seen is that, look, young people are still enterprising. I remember, I think someone here made a comment and said, look, if you want anything to change your leaders. Oh, if it was that easy, they would have done it, right? But we cannot excuse electoral fraud. If a lot of young people stand up in a line and go and vote, and they manipulate the votes, did they not do their job right? If a lot of young people study and take exams, but the proctor says, give me money that they don't have, but fail them and pass the one that has money, did they not do their job right? So when we talk about corruption, let's really talk about how it's affecting the everyday lives of people who are living in this system from the bottom levels, who are struggling to try to make ends meet, but also understanding that sometimes they're helpless in the system. And we have a lot of young people. Look at Nigeria, for instance. They passed a ready to young bill, right? Not too young to run. But the thing about it is that although these bills are progressive, let's look at the fact of the matter that in order to run in an election, you have to be almost a billionaire. That's the truth of the matter. We have a lot of educated, young, innovative people coming out of the continent of Africa. But the problem is that they're not understanding that it's almost we're losing that brain that we're supposed to be cultivating. Many of them have, progressive policies. Many of them have a progressive way that they would run the government. But the fact of the matter, they don't have the money. And they don't have that godfather that's going to usher them in. So we're ruled by, sometimes, of course, kleptocracy. We have kleptocratic politicians that are in office that are using the government as their own piggy bank, let's be honest. We also have godfathers in politics who are standing at the door, not letting these young people in. We have all of those things that are making it difficult for the next generation of leaders to sort of rise up. Until we address those issues, let's not talk about the 50 billion that we're losing that's coming out of the continent. What's most important is that if the young generation, if we don't get it right with them, we're going to be in a perpetual cycle that we have been seeing for so many years on end. So although a lot of the African governments, some of them are democratic on paper, they're a democracy, but they're not really a democracy, right? A democracy is when we are talking about equality, right? When we're making sure that everyone has equal opportunity. Everyone's rights are respected. And when we talk about corruption, corruption is only for the elites. They're the ones who are benefiting the most. And those who are on the local level are suffering the most. And the sad thing about it is that they too have to put that $20, their last money, into an envelope to get the services that are supposed to be free and provided by the government. So I want to hear more solutions and how do we address the human cost of corruption? How do we solve that, and how do we break the barriers of the normalization of deviant behavior? And for me, in my research, the only way that I think we can address that is ensuring that institutions of education are ethical and that we're hiring professors and teachers and administrators who are not muddling the field with culture and tradition, but are using it as a vehicle to inspire, educate the next generation of leaders, so that when they do become police officers, when they do become business officials, or investors, or CEOs, or judges, that they are ethical, right? They have a moral compass. Because if we talk about corruption, it's unethical, right? There's a moral compass that's missing there, right? And so if there's a breakdown in that area and it's stemming from early on in their childhood, perhaps maybe we can correct this sort of vehicle and cycle that we're seeing. So I'm just gonna, I guess, wrap it up from there. Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me take Let me take my prerogative as the chair of this session to ask a question to each of the speakers, but both can reflect on it. I was very struck the similarities in what both the speakers were talking about, which is new ways of thinking about corruption. For those of you who are here this morning, when Sherry Blair addressed us, she referred to it as the C word. But these speakers have tried to unpackage it from this amorphous blob into concrete ways and new ways of thinking about it. And I think Mohammed was quite controversial, if I understood him correctly, in suggesting that there are different types of corruption and that you're talking about, he mentioned the example of having to pay, everyone pays 20 Egyptian guinea to submit their paperwork, and that just becomes the cost of doing business. What is the overall impact? I think the overall impact is diminishing marginal returns. If everyone's paying that 20 pounds, you can factor that into business costs. It's the disproportionate impact on people when you have that extrapolate. But it's also, I think, about what happens to that corrupt money. And just to give one kind of personal example from Southeast Asia, my mother's from the Philippines, and Indonesia, comparative case study. Both the Suharto regime and the Marcos regime were in power for about the same amount of years. They were both equally corrupt, all right? But the Suharto regime took the money that was coming from various corruption things. He's like, you know what, I'm gonna have one son who's gonna start one of the largest steel companies in Asia, which is POSCO. It's still around today. We're gonna have the money now to copy what Korea's doing. And yes, we corrupt money raises, but it's gonna be invested back in the country, all right? Where, I'm sad to say, in the Philippine example, Marcos had a lot of Ilocano family in Oahu. He's like, let's put as much money as we can in Hawaii, build houses there, build cars there, so if this thing ever falls over, I can go to Hawaii, and that's exactly what he did. So all the capital that Marcos stole left the country, while the capital was corrupt, in the case of Suharto, a lot of it was reinvested in the country. So if I understand, that's kind of the dynamic you were talking about, right, Mohammed?
Yeah, didn't a lot of that Philippine money get invested into the America's shoe collection?
Yeah.
You know what? I'm going to be the one person who defends the Imelda Marcos shoe collection. If you do it mathematically, by how long they were in power, it's only one pair of shoes every 2 weeks, okay? That's not so bad. That's brilliant.
Well, two things here, if I may. The first thing on Indonesia in particular, the gentleman who was running the World Bank in the early 90s, had a really interesting, in an interview, said that we knew that out of every $4 we were putting in the country, 3 were being stolen. But we were okay with it because we knew that last dollar went to where we wanted it to go. The problem is that $1 wasn't going where it was supposed to go either. Right? So it's not a very good argument, I would say, to make the case for sort of that benevolent corruption, shall we say, sort of to borrow the term from benevolent dictatorship, on the assumption that corruption is going to actually lead somewhere. Closer to home we have Angola, right? You have to see how the Dos Santos and his family sort of reinvested their money. Right. And sure, some of these
they bought half of Lisbon, yeah. They bought half of Lisbon.
Yeah. And yes, some of these investments are generating revenue, but at the end of the day, it's a little as she was saying, like what's the human cost of that? What could have been done? What's the counterfactual? What could have been done with that money, right? Use that money sort of to buy, Portuguese public sector companies that were being on sale, but at the same time, that money could have been invested somewhere else. No, I think it's if we really want to go down especially to the small scale, to the petty corruption. It's important to realize that the people who are charging that extra bribe are people who are usually fairly poorly paid. Right? It's a big part of it is corruption of need, and as such, it becomes imperative for us to understand that corruption doesn't isn't necessarily a corruption of opportunity, but also often is a corruption of need, which again gives us clues into where do we, how do we reform the system? What are the, is there a case, essentially, is there a case to reward the corrupt people by increasing their salary to ensure that bribes are no longer bribes but are streamlined as part of the official fee? See how that's being put. That's the kind of thinking that is ugly to say as such, because at the end of the day, it's easy to think of it as rewarding those people. But we sort of need to understand where the causes are and how do you remedy them. And oftentimes, it becomes by addressing the fact that that we're dealing with people who have both an opportunity and a need. Now, the obverse of this, of course, is, don't think I'm pro-corruption, I'm not. I'm really not a fan of corruption. I'm just trying to understand how it works. The obverse of this, and is accountability, right? An immense problem that we have, and that goes from governments trying to streamline anti-corruption rules across all their ministry, all the way up to the international treaties. There are usually very little enforcing and accountability, right? Whether it's the EITI that has the Extractive Industries Treaty, that is hailed as the greatest transnational, the greatest transnational agreement anti-corruption, has no way of enforcing the results of its investigations. On one hand, all the way down to petty government officials that are charging the small bribes, and again, either we don't have the capacity to investigate and judge these, notwithstanding the fact that 9 out of 10 people who pay a bribe don't report this. So the information becomes very lacking, but then you have the added problem of who watches the watchers, right? So those people are being, the petty government officials that are corrupt, well, they're being theoretically watched by someone, but that other someone might be also corrupt, and therefore, and so on and so forth. So that's where that's how I see the problem.
I do want to sort of address, the world, address some of the policies that have come out of the World Bank and the IMF. Because when we talk about developing countries and what keeps them in perpetual stages of development and not ever coming out of that, is the fact of the matter is that we have to also look at structural adjustment programs. So it's just not only corruption, but the fact of the matter is that structural adjustment programs that came out of the World Bank also did not help countries in a way that was supposed to restructure them economically to be more prosperous and to be able to compete on a global playing field. Philippines were one of the examples of the failures of structural adjustment programs. So we have a lot of these neoliberal, neo-imperial policies that have not been helping developing countries, and that's really the truth. That a lot of the institutions, although their purpose and their premise is either to eradicate poverty, right, and to ensure that there's some form of global stability, what we have seen is that they're actually, that gap of the haves and the have-nots are widening because of that. With structural adjustment programs, the whole idea and the whole premise was that, look, if we loan you money, if we give a government millions and millions of dollars, you have to follow certain conditions. Just like when you buy a car, you get a loan, you don't pay back the car, you don't pay back the loan, your car can get repossessed. There's certain conditions. They won't repossess the country, but the fact of the matter is that in order for them to give you that loan, they're going to say, look, you have to restructure your economy. And you have to sell off some of your state-owned enterprises. You have to remove some of the federal funding from certain sectors, such as education, such as health, such as sectors that matter to the vitality of a society. And they say these things, and then you wonder, why is this country still in a form of development? And not only that, of course they have said, look, we've done our best by providing technical advisement and oversight and surveillance mechanisms to ensure that this money is not going to corrupt governments. But what we have seen in the past is that money has been loaned to corrupt governments. Philippines have been the example of that, where millions of dollars are taken from the World Bank. It's supposed to help the citizens in restructuring their economy, but goes into private pockets, right? Or goes into private foreign direct, businesses that come into this country to invest and profit off of the instability and profit off of corruption that is there. So let's be clear, corruption does benefit a few. It benefits oftentimes those who are in governments or who are in kleptocratic governments, and it also benefits the business people that come to to invest their money into these countries. They know what these countries are about. They know the rules and regulations are not enforced. They know the history of what has happened in the past. They're not blindsided by this. They're not entrepreneurs who are just sort of on the global stage and trying to find where should I invest my money and invest my innovation. They're very clear of what they're stepping into. So we have to also look at some of these policies that have been that has been circulating, that has not benefited many of these LDC countries. And we have to look at the role that, many of these institutions play. We say that there's no form of global governance, but I beg to differ. These are institutions who are governing the world. They are governing the world. And we have to ask some serious questions. That are they making the playing field level? Are they making it a level playing field for all? And we have seen that has not necessarily been the case. So there's a lot of ways we can talk about corruption. There's a lot of solutions we can provide, a lot of angles that we can sort of cut and dissect this topic in. But most importantly, can we not just forget about the human cost of corruption?
Speaking of many ways to dice the topic of corruption, why don't we have some questions from the audience? Please raise your hand. That's the first question I see right there. Please identify yourself.
My name is Benjamin Winterstein. I'm an anthropologist who works with the US DoD to help them deal with problems in Africa. And my question for you is, you intimated several times that there's an enculturalization and normalization problem of corruption. But how much of corruption is actually adaptive? Particularly in hedging and other behaviors that are designed to reduce uncertainty given the instability in Africa. And my question ultimately is, would adaptive behaviors have a different solution than encultured ones?
I say it's a norm, that came out of the Chicago School of Theory. It's called normalization of deviant behavior. And the normalization of deviant behavior, we were looking at sort of organizations to figure out, okay, how do people in organizations behave, right? If you're in a room here and there are 10 people who are pocketing money, and you walk in the room and you say, don't do that, and they all look at you and say, get out, or they fire you, you lose your job. Now another person comes in and say, okay, 10 people are pocketing money, the other person just lost their job, what should I do? Should I pocket the money too, or should I raise an alarm? You may adapt, like you're saying, to that institution or to the norms or cultures that that institution has. But what happens is that when that permeates throughout the whole society, when you can go to almost a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old and they know that, look, in order for me to buy, to cross the street, the police officer is going to say, hey, give me a little bit of change or, sweeten my pocket. It becomes what we call a culture. It becomes a normalization of a deviant behavior. So it may be adaptive at first to sort of be able to have a survival mechanism and for whatever reason, but when you see that it's happening in a way that it's all around you, it's through every sector, it doesn't matter the job, it doesn't matter the nature, it doesn't matter the institution, then we get to a point where we've created a culture. And not that everybody accepts it, but it's the fact that this is how we have to sort of get on with our lives.
And to get a couple questions out there, we'll take this question and we'll take that question and then they can respond.
Mine's more of a comment and not of a question. My name is Yemi Adeboye. I work for Initiative for Advancement of Ethical Standard. And I'm going to focus my comment on Nigeria. When we talk about corruption and how to handle it, I think accountability is very important. I live in a country where money is worshipped more than achievement. When somebody who has no feasible means of income just suddenly becomes a millionaire, do we ask a question? Do we ask him, where did you get the money from? If we create an environment whereby we ask questions, like I live in this country. If suddenly 500,000 gets into my account, somebody's going to be knocking my door and say, where did you get the 500,000 from? But in Nigeria, that is not the case. Somebody comes with millions, we worship him. And that is why corruption is difficult to eradicate in a country like Nigeria. Because we prefer people achieving and getting money without any feasible means of income. And that's most of the problem we have. Talking about politics, people who somebody who has no physical achievement in life comes and contests for an election, and we voted for him, what do you expect him to do when he gets there? It's going to be corruption. So if we really want to deal with corruption in Africa, we need to have what is called cultural orientation. We need to have ethical changes so that we can get this corruption out of the system. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Stephen Akintai. I'm a serial entrepreneur, and I have two questions. Number one, what really is the goal of meetings like this where we organize and it's the saints that are usually in the room, right? The corrupt officials are not here. I wish the ministers, the presidents can be here, because I mean some of what you said really could appeal to their conscience to really change. You know, so we gather the right people in the room, we enjoy ourselves, you know, by discussing what is going on. And so how do we then begin to get the right people in the room so that they can hear this? The second part of my question is that the international community loves to talk about this corruption, but the real corruption is incompetence. The real corruption in Africa is incompetence. Now, anybody just wakes up and say, I'm for the masses, you know, I'm going to fight corruption, but you don't know jack, right, about economics. You don't know how to turn $2 to $4. Then you get there, you can build roads, you can grow businesses, and then again, you go back to the story of, oh, it was because the previous government were corrupt. So how do we begin to solve the corruption of incompetence in Africa?
We'll get one more question out there, and then we'll give is there another question? All right, then we'll go back to the panelists for the response.
Well, I mean, we have meetings to have dialogue and to discuss ways forward, because I think the assumption is that in order to create change, you have to do it through politics. Most changes actually happens outside of politics. Most reform happens outside of politics. So I think for people who believe that I'm going to go into politics and I'm going to change the whole system, may feel very disappointed, because it's a system. And oftentimes that system is much bigger than the individuals. You do have some powerful people, but it's a system, and that system has been operating and entrenched in that way for decades and years, and people have adapted and conformed to what that system is. So you may not be able to change the system, but reform happens outside of that, right? Cultural orientation, like you brought up, extremely important, can happen in schools, can happen in institutions of education, ensuring that civil society flourishes. Civil society are those who hold the government accountable. They are organizations and non-governmental organizations who sort of shed the touchlight on some of these issues that are going on in our society. So let's not just put all our eggs in one basket and say, well, if we can't reform politics, then that means that there's no reform that's going to happen. I think reform, to be honest, happens outside of politics, and I'm hoping that it will have some form of effect there. And then your second question was incompetence. You know, when you don't look at politics as public service, it's not necessarily just, it's not incompetence in a sense, because you'll see that many of them are very brilliant on what they do with their money. Many of them are extremely brilliant in how they hide their money, and in how they invest their money, and how they try to disclose how much money they're taking. So it's not that they are not intelligent, it's not that they're incompetent, it's just an unwillingness to understand what politics really is. And politics is public service. It's the ability to hear the needs and the desires of your constituents, of the people, and to serve them. So you are appointed, you are not anointed. So in Nigerian politics, and in politics not only in Nigeria and African countries and all over the world, there's a tendency to feel that there must be something so special about me that I'm in this position, so I'm better than everyone else, right? They're there to serve me, they're there to praise me, but politics, I'm there to serve you. I'm there to listen to your needs and your desires. So if your needs and your desires as a generation of young people is, I need a job. So then I, as a politician, should be creating policies and working on how do I provide those jobs to this group of people. If it's those who are disabled, if it's issues for women. So again, it's the thinking of what the political system is. And I think that is sort of misconstrued with a lot of politicians.
Sure. Okay, let me take them backwards. First one on incompetence. Someone once told me that the only thing that's worse than a thief is a stupid thief. And working with startups and entrepreneurs, you realize that a big part, a lot of their complaint is that they're dealing with counterparts, mostly within the state, that have no idea what they're doing. And most of the time they're just trying to extract as much money as possible. Which is part of the reason why we have such a huge informal sector in a large number of our countries. Is that because people like you, sir, choose not to register their businesses because they know that it will bring them more trouble than will help, right? They also know that there's no accountability for it, and that's a different issue. But a big part of it is that you're aware that you're dealing with people who would more likely to sort of break your business for them to extract rent out of you than to be supported. So I'm not challenging that corruption, incompetence is a massive issue. I think it becomes important and which sort of leads a little bit to your first question, why do we have these discussions? Because it becomes interesting for me to hear from your experience as an entrepreneur what your problem is. Maybe your problem isn't sort of the registration process and all of that, but it's actually the secondary sort of transactions with the rest of the government. Say, you have a startup that works in health and you work with Ministry of Health, and Ministry of Economy is fine, is helpful, but these guys are terrible. Right? So it becomes more interesting for us to understand what's happening. And another part of the reason, which sort of brings me to events like these, is that on a discussion like this, we know that some countries have been more successful than others, right? So actually I'm going to throw the call sort of to you. Countries that have been doing significantly better in corruption indices in Africa, such as Cape Verde, such as Botswana, I believe ranked among the highest within Africa. Rwanda has been climbing the ranks rapidly. So it's a learning experience for someone like me to sort of ask people who know more about the actual experience.
Thank you so much to both these panelists who throw it back to us to try to bring change, and we hope that you also try to bring change to your countries. Yetunde, perhaps you could run for office one day, like you were talking about. And I don't hope that for Mohammed. His country's a horrible dictatorship, so that would probably not end well for him. But let's have a round of applause for these speakers.